All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's do one more. I'm trying to think. I think this may be the last one that we do for the semester, as far as lecture videos are concerned. So that's kind of cool. Let's talk about the endocrine system. So we're going to kind of continue talking about this regulation idea. We did the nervous system earlier, right? And that was sort of like electrical regulation. Now we're going to get into more chemical regulation and how those are different. Some of the things that we're going to talk about in this particular lecture, we're going to look at what the endocrine system is, what the different parts are, the different hormones, different types of hormones, stuff like that. And look at some feedback systems that you'll probably need to use in the next few days. So, well, geez, I guess let's go ahead and get started.
Glands, dun 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 dun. Glands, dun 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 dun. Glands, dun 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 dun. Glands.
All right, so here we are. Let's talk about the endocrine system a little bit, okay? So the endocrine system are the cells and tissues that are responsible for making hormones. And hormones are basically just chemical messengers, okay? A message that I'm sending from one part of the body to the other. So this would be like physically sending a message, like writing a note and handing it to somebody versus calling somebody up on the phone. That would be more electrical, like nervous system. Okay. It controls and coordinates the various body processes. It works in conjunction with the nervous system. And so when we're talking about the endocrine system, what we want to talk about is intercellular communication, because that's what's happening. How do my brain cells talk to my muscle cells? How do my brain cells talk to my heart cells, my digestive tract cells, that sort of thing? And so we've got four mechanisms, at least four mechanisms. We've got direct communication. Direct communication is it's cell-to-cell communication through direct contact. There are these things called gap junctions, which are basically kind of like little holes where two cells are sitting next to each other like this, and they have this little section here in the middle that they can pass ions and other substances through from one cell to the other. These are cells within the same type, so same tissues, for example. It's highly specialized but very rare. We also have paracrine communication, and this sends chemical information from cell to cell within a single tissue. They're not directly touching each other, so they're close to each other. This would be more like, here's a cell, and then it's going to send a little blip of information across to tell them what to do, where to move, and stuff like that. Then we have autocrine communication. Now, auto means within, like within oneself. If something is automatic, it happens within itself. It doesn't require anything outside to make it happen. And so this is communication within the cell that secreted the molecule in the first place. The cell's talking to itself. These chemicals are known as autocrines. Prostaglandins in the smooth muscle cells causing those muscle cells to contract. Okay, so it's sort of an internal monologue within the cell. And then we have endocrine communication. And so endocrine cells release hormones. These are chemicals that are transported in the bloodstream. So these are very long distances. Mailing a letter would be an example of this. Okay, and you have alteration of metabolic activity. So within intercellular communication, you have what are known as target cells. And these target cells have specific receptors in order to read hormonal messages. And so here's something that's important to keep in mind. Certain hormones have specific receptors. And I'm going to go ahead and change something real quick. Boop, 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 boop. Hormones have specific receptors. So adrenaline is a hormone. You have cells that are adrenaline receptors. They're not going to respond to testosterone, okay? So if a cell doesn't have adrenaline receptors, it's not going to hear the message, okay? Hormones are chemicals that change the type, the structure, and the activity of enzymes and other proteins in the target cells. Remember, proteins are the things that do the work, right? They can alter metabolic activities and alter long-term processes like growth and development. We've kind of talked about synapses, so I'm going to go through this really, really quickly. Okay, we've hit it a couple of times at this point. And so neurotransmitters, which are kind of like hormones, but they are only within a particular synapse, which lead to action potentials that are propagated along axons in subsequent nerve cells, which is allowing these messages to reach different destinations. It's good for crisis management. Like I said, it's a gatekeeper, okay? If the stimulus is not strong enough, there's not enough stimulus coming in, then the message is going to die at the synapse, okay? All right, comparisons between the two. They both rely on chemicals to relay information. Those chemicals have to bond to specific receptor cells. We talked about acetylcholine was a neurotransmitter that's really important in muscle function. They can only bind to acetylcholine receptors, okay? Acetylcholine will not bind to dopamine receptors, for example. They share many chemical messages. For example, norepinephrine and epinephrine are very similar. They're both involved in the fight or flight pathway, but they're technically two different chemicals. One of them is a neurotransmitter, the other one is a hormone. And they function to preserve homeostasis by coordinating and regulating activities, and they are regulated by negative feedback. I don't know why that popped up all by itself. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of the endocrine system. Now, this is all of the cells and tissues that produce hormones and paracrines. Endocrine cells release secretions into the extracellular fluid, so outside of the cell, into the blood, stuff like that. Which are different from exocrine cells. Exocrine cells, like sweat glands, mass excrete, mass release large amounts of substances, either internally or externally. The cells that are responsible for releasing stomach acid, okay, is an example. Sweat glands, oil glands are another example of exocrine glands. Endocrine organs are scattered throughout the body, and we're going to talk about pretty much all of them. Okay, let's talk about hormones for just a second. There are three types of hormones. Amino acid derivatives, peptides, and lipid derivatives. Okay, the first ones are the amino acid derivatives. They're small molecules related to amino acids. Are actually derived from, like, tryptophan is one example. Examples of these types of hormones are the thyroid hormones, catecholamines, which are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, serotonin, and melatonin. We've got our peptide hormones, and they are chains of amino acids, not quite proteins. They're not big enough. They are synthesized as prohormones, and these are basically inactivated hormones that become activated later. A lot of the hormones that are released by the pancreas, for example, are prohormones. Other ones include hypothalamus, the heart, the thymus, other parts of the digestive tract, the pituitary gland, are all peptides. Then we've got lipid derivatives, and there's two kinds. Eicosanoids, which are derived from arachidonic acid, which is a large fatty acid. There's not too many of those. A lot of those are like our paracrines, that sort of thing. The big one that we're going to talk about, though, are the steroid hormones. These are derived from cholesterol. Examples of this one include androgens, testosterone, and estrogen. Or androgens like testosterone, I apologize. Androgens like testosterone. Estrogen in females. Corticosteroids, which are natural anti-inflammatories. And calcitriol which is activated vitamin D, and it's vital for calcium uptake in your bones. These are big, and they tend to circulate longer in peptides, and there's actually a store of these in your blood that can be tapped into when necessary. Speaking of that, so they can be bound in proteins. Free hormones are usually good for about an hour, and then they are inactivated. The thyroid hormones and the steroid hormones stay in your blood longer, like I just said. Most of them are attached to transport proteins. That's why they're allowed to stay in there for very long. And so the bloodstream, like I said, is a reserve. Okay, mechanisms of hormone action. You can take entire courses talking about all this stuff. We're not going to go nearly to that level of detail. A hormone binding to a receptor. It can do a few different things. It can alter genetic activity, alter the rate of protein synthesis, or change membrane permeability, allow some things in or out, or stop some things from crossing when normally it could. Your hormone receptors, which we had kind of already talked about for a little bit, is a particular protein in the membrane. Sometimes they can be within inside for like autocrines that a particular molecule binds to. The presence or absence of a receptor determines how sensitive a cell is. So if there aren't a lot of receptors, or there are no receptors, like I said earlier, that cell is not going to respond to that hormone. If there's a boatload of receptors, then it's going to be very sensitive, and you only need just a little bit to trigger some sort of response. You can have different types of regulation and what the hormones do, basically. So there's down regulation, where the hormone triggers a decrease in receptors. So as hormone levels increase, the cell becomes less sensitive, kind of like an oversaturation sort of thing. Upregulation is the opposite. The hormone triggers an increase in receptors, so the lower the level, the more sensitive the cells are. Okay, so now let's talk about the specific glands. Okay, we'll start with some of the ones that are in the brain with the pituitary. You probably saw this when you did the brain dissection, either virtual or in person. It's technically associated with the endocrine system. So the pituitary gland, also known as the, let me write this down, hypophysis. Oops, it's supposed to be a Y. So you may see it both ways. Hypophysis, pituitary gland, it's the same thing. Okay, so this hangs inferior to the hypothalamus. And so if you look at this picture, too far. If you look at this picture right up here, your hypothalamus is actually sitting in this little spot right here. Okay, and so here's the pituitary gland, sort of embedded in your skull, basically. And it releases 9 important peptide hormones, and I'll list those here in just a little bit. Speaking of the hypothalamus is sort of the master controller of the body. It measures body temperature, blood pressure, all sorts of stuff like that. And then what it does is it tells the pituitary gland what to do. That's it. It doesn't directly influence any of the processes in the body. It synthesizes antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and I'll talk about those later, and transports them to the pituitary to be released. It secretes regulatory hormones that tell the pituitary either to release or stop releasing specific hormones. It can also directly control the adrenal medulla, with part of the adrenal gland, which we'll talk about later. And so that's this pathway right here, which we'll get into. And that's typically associated with your fight or flight response. There are 2 lobes of the pituitary, the anterior and the posterior. The anterior lobe, which is this part right here, is also known as the adenohypophysis. and its hormones activate other glands and help regulate and support other organs. Okay, so here are the hormones of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone, that is going to tell the thyroid to release thyroid hormones, which we'll get into in a little bit. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to influence the release of it is going to influence the activity of the adrenal cortex. So the hypothalamus can control it directly. It can also tell the pituitary to control it, and we'll talk about that later. Prolactin is another one. I would like to pause here for just a second. As you're going through, maybe make a table or something like that of the glands and the hormones that they produce, as well as some of their functions where available. Okay, so you can kind of keep those straight. Okay, anyway, prolactin. Prolactin is released. So here's the controlling hormones I was talking about. Prolactin inhibiting hormone stops the release of prolactin. Prolactin is stimulated by the prolactin releasing hormone. You've also got growth hormone or somatotropin and gonadotropins, which are influential in gonad development. Gonadotropins, there are a couple of them. Follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. We're going to talk about those in much greater detail at the end of the school year when we do the reproductive system. The luteinizing hormone in females induces ovulation and stimulates estrogen secretion. In males, it stimulates androgen secretion, testosterone. Those are both stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus. The posterior lobe of the pituitary, so this part right here, is called the neurohypophysis, and it produces antidiuretic hormone, which tells your kidneys to alter their urine production, which is going to change your blood volume, and we'll talk about that later. And oxytocin is going to stimulate the contraction of the uterus during labor, and it's also going to stimulate the ejection of milk after delivery, which we'll talk about that in a whole lot greater detail during the reproductive system again. Here is a diagram. Pull this from the lecture notes or freeze this and take a screen grab and drop it in your notes or something like that, of the hormones that are released by the pituitary gland and the organs that they affect. Some of the hormones are direct release, like the posterior lobe going to the kidneys and stuff like that. Direct control by the nervous system via the hypothalamus is also in here also. Maybe, so hold on to this and use it sort of as a summary. Let's move on to a different gland. Here we have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, and we'll talk about what all that means in the respiratory unit in the spring. It's about here-ish or so, and there's two lobes connected by a narrow isthmus, and so that's just a thin strip of tissue right here. So if you look at this picture right here, here is the thyroid cartilage right here, and here is the thyroid itself. I always kind of thought it looked like a brain. Okay, so the thyroid is really, really important. It releases two primary hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. okay? Triiodothy. The turtle here says it's triiodothyronine. Thanks, turtle. These are triggered by the release of thyroid-stimulating hormone. Read through that. We're going to skip that because we need to move on. Okay, thyroid hormones are super important. They affect, not infect, almost every cell in the body. They enter the target cells, bind to the receptors in cytoplasm, on the mitochondria, and in the nucleus. And so they're really important for metabolic activity and stuff like that. In children, they're really, really important for the development of the skeletal muscle and the nervous system. If thyroid function drops off after too early, you can have failure of development of the skeletal system, the bones, the muscle system, and the nervous system. It's pretty bad news. So, thyroid hormones are activated by genes involved in glycolysis and ATP production. And so they're going to have a lot to do with body temperature control. This is known as a calorigenic effect. And so basically what ends up happening as you are stimulating the release of these hormones, that's going to increase the release of glucose and the production of ATP, which is going to accelerate metabolic activity, and that's going to generate heat. Once concentrations of the T3 and T4 hormones go up and body temperature increases, then that process stops right here, and you basically maintain at that point. And then once body temperature gets too low, or T3 and T4 concentrations get too low, you start this process over again. This is one of your negative feedback loops. And this is one of the ways that, like, if maybe you've got a fever or something like that, that's how your body starts to increase its temperature, or if you start to get too cold and stuff like that. You start to get other physiological symptoms that you're too cold. So that's one feedback loop in here. You've also got C cells, and they're notable for releasing calcitonin. Calcitonin helps regulate calcium in the blood. It stimulates excretion by the kidneys. So absorption, absorption, and prevents absorption by the digestive tract. So it helps lower those levels of calcium. Okay, other effects of thyroid hormones elevate oxygen and energy consumption, which can cause a rise in body temperature in children, increase heart rate, increase sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation. Sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight, so accelerating the nervous system. Maintaining sensitivity of respiratory sensors to gas concentrations, stimulating red blood cell formation, stimulating activity in other endocrine tissues, and accelerating turnover of minerals in bone, primarily calcium. Parathyroid glands, which are located on the thyroid. You've got two pairs. They look like these little, almost like purple pimples, basically. Here, that's one pair. That's two pairs. They are super tiny. All four together weigh about 1.6 grams, which is like hardly nothing. They secrete parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is released in response to low concentrations of calcium in the blood. It's going to stimulate osteoclasts, which are going to start releasing calcium from the bones. It's going to break the bones down, remember. And then it enhances reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys. And so, quick version, the kidneys are going to filter stuff. Things that we want to be released into the body get excreted and they go out as urine. Other things that we want to keep, they get filtered out at one stage and then they get reabsorbed at another stage. while keeping in all the waste products. And so parathyroid hormone is going to tell the kidneys to reabsorb. So parathyroid hormones are an antagonist for calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to stimulate calcium uptake by the bones and removing it from the body, thereby lowering the concentration in the bloodstream. Parathyroid hormone is going to do the opposite. And so here is a flow chart illustrating that process. If it gets too high, like you see right here, these are the steps that we go through to lower that number back to the range that we want it to be in. If it gets to be too low, then we go through these steps to bring it up back to the level that we want. So here's another flow chart for us. All right, now we have the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are on the superior end of the kidneys. So if you've got your kidneys like beans, like this right here, your adrenal glands sit on top of them like little dunce caps. They've got two parts, a cortex and a medulla. The adrenal cortex stores lipids like cholesterol and manufactures corticosteroids, which are anti-inflammatories. The medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are responsible for your fight or flight response. Too far. Let's see, another hormone that is produced by the adrenal glands is aldosterone, which is responsible for conserving sodium potassium ions in the blood, so it keeps them from getting filtered out. It increases sensitivity of salt receptors in taste buds, so you kind of are craving salt, basically, and so things with salt in it you become more receptive to. And this is secreted in response to drops in sodium concentration in the blood, drops in blood pressure, and drops in blood volume. Also, a rise in potassium concentration. So trying to balance bringing in sodium and getting rid of potassium. So corticosteroids, the main one we're going to talk about released by the adrenal glands are glucocorticosteroids, cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. They're regulated by negative feedback. They accelerate glucose synthesis and glycogen formation in the liver and inhibits white blood cells and other components of the immune system. Those are the anti-inflammatory effects. So these are going to tell the liver to start storing glucose in the liver. The adrenal medulla, so that was all in the adrenal cortex. Okay, this outer portion right here. The medulla, which is this inner part right here, has two types of cells. One of them produces epinephrine and the other one produces norepinephrine. Pretty straightforward. In activating the medulla, glycogen is mobilized in skeletal muscles, which releases energy for the muscles to be broken down by the mitochondria to turn into ATP. Fats are broken down into fatty acids. Glycogen is broken down in the liver. Cardiac muscle contraction increases and strengthens in the heart. This is your fight or flight response. All right, we've got the pineal gland right here. Ooh, too far. The pineal gland lies in the posterior portion of the third ventricle, so right in the center of the brain. You may have seen it when you did the dissection. You may not have. It's sometimes kind of difficult. This synthesizes melatonin, which influences circadian rhythms, so day-night cycles and like when you get tired and stuff like that. It inhibits reproductive functions and protects against damage by free radicals. Free radicals are molecules that are highly reactive and can damage cells. So, yeah, so this is like when it gets dark and you get tired gland, and when you wake up and you're awake, it's sunny and you're awake gland, basically. Tell you what, I think we'll call it right there. I'm gonna go ahead and split these videos up into multiples. From here on out, once you go into the next video, we've got, we'll start with the pancreas right here, and we're looking at our glands elsewhere in the body, okay? The adrenal gland, I guess, technically fell into that category, but whatever, okay? So stay tuned for part 2. We'll talk about the rest of these. We'll also talk about how the different organ systems work together and what happens when you get older and stuff like that. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email, send me a remind message, ask me in class. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
So just chill till the next episode.